The pastry box corners bit into my palms as I navigated the marble corridors of Red Marrow Estate, my cheap shoes squeaking against floors that probably cost more than my annual rent. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across oil paintings of stern-faced men in expensive suits, their eyes seeming to follow my every nervous step. The whispered conversations floating from doorways spoke of numbers that made my head spin. Territories, percentages, consequences. I didn't belong here. The borrowed coat over my cafe uniform felt like a costume, and every man in a tailored suit who passed me looked through me as if I were invisible staff, unworthy of acknowledgement. I was only here because my boss had begged me to make this late-night delivery. Important clients, she'd said, pressing the address into my palm with shaking hands. They specifically requested our pastries for their meeting. The way she'd hesitated over that last word should have been my first warning. The coffee service rattled on my tray as I approached the designated room, trying to ignore the way conversations died when I passed. Through an open doorway, I glimpsed a long mahogany table surrounded by men whose very presence seemed to command the air around them. That's when I felt it. The weight of eyes on me. Not the dismissive glances I'd been receiving all evening, but something heavier, more deliberate. The sensation crawled up my spine like a physical touch. I turned slowly, following the electric pull. He stood apart from the others, half shadowed by an alcove, flanked by two men whose stillness spoke of coiled violence. Even in the dim light, his presence seemed to bend the space around him. Tall, with dark hair and a face carved from marble, he wore his expensive suit like armor. But it was his eyes that made my breath catch, dark, intense, and fixed on me with an attention that felt both dangerous and oddly protective. Behind him, I noticed how other men unconsciously stepped aside when he shifted, how voices lowered when he was near. This wasn't just wealth. This was power. I quickly looked away, focusing on my task, but my hands trembled as I backed toward the council room with the coffee service. That's when disaster struck. I collided with something solid and warm. Hot coffee splashed across expensive Italian leather, and my horrified gasp echoed in the suddenly silent hallway. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry," I babbled, dropping to my knees to frantically dab at the mess with napkins, not daring to look up. "I'll pay for the cleaning, A hand touched my chin, tilting my face upward with gentle but irresistible pressure. It was him. "Look at me when you apologize," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the background murmur like silk over steel. The hallway had gone completely silent. Through the doorway, I could see the men at the council table had stopped their conversations, all eyes turned toward us. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. "I'm sorry," I whispered, meeting his dark gaze. "I didn't mean to. It's not a problem," he said simply, but his focus on me was absolute, as if the spilled coffee and watching men didn't exist. "What's your name?" "Loretta Capps." He repeated it slowly, like he was committing it to memory. "Loretta." From the council room, someone muttered something about the help, but the man before me, this stranger who commanded rooms with his presence, never looked away from my face. "I'll have a driver see you home when you're finished here," he said. It wasn't quite a request. Before I could respond, he was gone, moving toward the council room where important men waited. But as I gathered the scattered napkins and tried to steady my racing heart, I could feel his attention like a brand between my shoulder blades. 3 hours earlier, I'd been wiping down tables at Sunrise Cafe, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like dying insects. The dinner rush had been brutal. truckers demanding endless coffee refills, businessmen who left exact change and no tip, teenagers who ordered one muffin and camped out for hours with their laptops. "Loretta, honey, can you stay late tonight?" My boss, Janet, had emerged from the back office looking frazzled, her graying hair escaping its bun. "I've got a special delivery request, and you're the only one I trust with it." I'd glanced at the clock. Nearly 9 p.m. My feet ached, my uniform smelled like bacon grease, and all I wanted was to go home to my tiny apartment and collapse on my second-hand couch. "What kind of delivery?" Janet had wrung her hands, avoiding my eyes. "Some fancy estate up in the hills. They want our signature pastries and coffee service for a late meeting. They're paying triple our usual rate." Triple rate. That would cover my electric bill and maybe leave enough for groceries that weren't ramen noodles. "Fine," I'd sighed, "but I'm charging overtime." Of course. Janet had practically sagged with relief. "The address is Red Marrow Estate. Just be professional, okay? These are very important people." The way she'd said important had made my stomach twist, but I'd needed the money too badly to ask questions. Now, standing in this marble palace surrounded by men who looked like they could buy and sell entire city blocks, I understood why Janet had been nervous. This wasn't just wealth. This was the kind of power that operated in shadows, the kind that made people disappear. I finished setting up the coffee service in the council room, my hands steadier now that I had a task to focus on. The men around the table barely acknowledged my presence, continuing their low-voiced conversation about shipments and territories and names I didn't recognize. Better that way. I didn't want to hear anything that might make me a liability. "The Torino situation needs to be resolved," one man was saying, his voice gravelly with age and cigarettes. "They're getting too bold." "Lucchesi will handle it," another replied. "He always does." Lucchesi. The name sent a shiver through me, though I couldn't say why. I was arranging the last of the pastries when I felt that gaze again, heavier now, more focused. I glanced up to find the man from the hallway standing in the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. So this was Lucchesi. He moved into the room with fluid grace, and I watched as the other men straightened almost imperceptibly. Not fear, exactly, but respect tinged with wariness. He took his seat at the head of the table without a word, but his presence filled the space like smoke. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Shall we begin?" I gathered my empty tray and headed for the door, eager to escape the suffocating weight of all that masculine power. But as I reached the threshold, his voice stopped me. "Miss Capps." I turned, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every man at the table was looking at me now, their expressions ranging from curious to dismissive. "Yes?" "Thank you for the excellent service." His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "I trust you'll find your way out safely." It was a dismissal, but it felt like a promise. Or maybe a threat. I couldn't tell which. "Thank you," I managed, and fled. The drive home in the sleek black car he'd arranged was a blur of city lights and racing thoughts. The driver, a silent man with scarred hands, had appeared at my elbow the moment I'd finished packing up, as if he'd been waiting for some invisible signal. "Mr. Cattaneo asked me to ensure you arrive home safely," he'd said, opening the passenger door of a car that probably cost more than I'd make in 5 years. Cattaneo. So that was his last name. Lucchesi Cattaneo. I'd wanted to refuse, to insist I could take the bus like always, but something in the driver's tone suggested this wasn't really a request. And after the way those men had looked at me, like I was something that might need to be dealt with, I wasn't sure I wanted to be alone on public transportation. Now, as the car pulled up to my shabby apartment building, I felt the weight of the evening settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The driver waited until I was safely inside before pulling away, and I watched his taillights disappear into the night with a mixture of relief and strange disappointment. In my tiny bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. Same brown hair, same ordinary face, same tired eyes. But something felt different, changed, like I'd crossed some invisible line tonight and couldn't find my way back. I thought about Lucchesi Cattaneo's dark eyes, the way he'd said my name like he was tasting it, the way every man in that room had deferred to him without question, the way he'd looked at me, not through me like everyone else, but at me, really at me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, an unknown number. "Thank you for tonight. Sleep well, Loretta." My hands shook as I stared at the message. How did he have my number? When had he gotten it? I set the phone aside without responding, but I couldn't stop thinking about those final words. Not good night or thanks again. Sleep well. Like he was watching over me, like he cared whether I was safe. I pulled my thin blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. Every time I started to drift off, I felt those dark eyes on me again and heard that voice saying my name like a prayer or a claim. Outside my window, a car engine idled quietly in the darkness before finally driving away. But I told myself I was imagining things. Men like Lucchesi Cattaneo didn't waste time thinking about girls like me, did they? I didn't know then that I was already his next decision. I didn't know that my ordinary life had ended the moment I'd looked into his eyes and seen something that recognized me. I didn't know that tomorrow, everything would change. But somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, I dreamed of marble halls and dark eyes, and the feeling of being seen, really seen, for the first time in my life. Subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story unfolds darker, deeper, and far more dangerous than you think. Now, let's begin the tale. The next morning, I told myself it had been a weird one-time interaction. Nothing more than a rich man being polite to the help. The text message was probably just good manners, the kind of courtesy that came naturally to people raised with money and power. I repeated this mantra as I tied my apron strings and started the coffee machines at Sunrise Cafe. The familiar routine of grinding beans and wiping down counters should have grounded me, should have made last night feel like a strange dream. Instead, every mundane task felt hollow, like I was going through the motions of someone else's life. "You look tired, honey," Janet said, emerging from the back office with a stack of receipts. "Late night?" "Something like that." I focused on arranging pastries in the display case, avoiding her curious gaze. The delivery went fine, by the way. They seemed satisfied. "Good, good." She paused, studying my face. "They didn't give you any trouble, did they? I know those types can be demanding." Those types. As if she knew exactly what kind of men I'd served coffee to last night. As if she'd deliberately sent me into that marble palace knowing what I might encounter. "No trouble," I lied. The morning rush started early, a steady stream of construction workers and office employees grabbing coffee and pastries before heading to jobs that made sense, jobs that existed in daylight. I served them with automatic efficiency, my mind elsewhere, replaying every moment of the previous evening. The way Lucchesi had looked at me. The way he'd said my name. The text message that had kept me awake until nearly 3 a.m. I was refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door chimed. I glanced up automatically, expecting another regular customer, and nearly dropped the entire container. Lucchesi Cattaneo stood in the doorway of Sunrise Cafe, looking impossibly out of place among the chipped formica tables and fluorescent lighting. His charcoal suit probably cost more than the cafe's monthly rent, and his presence seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. The construction worker at table 3 actually choked on his coffee. "Good morning, Loretta," Lucchesi said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden silence. My mouth went dry. "Good morning. Can I help you?" He approached the counter with that same fluid grace I remembered, seemingly oblivious to the stares following his every movement. "Coffee, please. Black. 2 sugars." That was exactly how I took my coffee. The coincidence made my hands tremble as I reached for a cup. "For here or to go?" I managed. "Here." He glanced around the cafe with mild interest, as if he were cataloging every detail. "I have time." I poured his coffee with shaking hands, hyper-aware of every eye in the place watching our interaction. Behind me, I could hear Janet whispering urgently into her phone, probably calling her husband to come see the expensive stranger who'd wandered into their humble establishment. Lucchesi accepted the cup with a slight nod, his fingers brushing mine as he took it. The contact sent electricity shooting up my arm. "Thank you." He moved to an empty table by the window, settling into the plastic chair like it was a throne. For the next hour he sat there, sipping his coffee and occasionally glancing at his phone. But mostly, he watched me. Not obviously, not in a way that would make the other customers uncomfortable, but I felt his attention like a physical weight. During my break, I finally worked up the courage to approach his table. "Is everything okay with your coffee?" I asked, wiping my palms on my apron. "Perfect." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit with me." "I can't. I'm working. Your break started 3 minutes ago." At my surprised look, he smiled slightly. "I pay attention." Against my better judgment, I sat. Up close, in the harsh fluorescent light, he was even more devastating. Dark hair perfectly styled, olive skin that spoke of Mediterranean ancestry, and those eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul. "What are you doing here?" I asked quietly. "Having coffee." "You know what I mean." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with that unnerving intensity. "Tell me about yourself, Loretta. Your family, your dreams." "Why?" "Because I'm interested." The simple honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I found myself talking, telling him about my parents who died in a car accident when I was 19, about working my way through community college, about dreams of opening my own bakery someday that felt increasingly impossible with each passing year. He listened without interruption, asking occasional questions that showed he was really hearing me. When was the last time someone had listened to me like that? When was the last time someone had cared about my answers? "You're wasted here," he said finally. "Excuse me?" "This place. This life. You're capable of so much more." Heat flashed through me. Anger or attraction, I couldn't tell which. "There's nothing wrong with honest work." "I didn't say there was. I said you were wasted here." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When was the last time someone saw your potential, Loretta? Really saw it?" Before I could answer, my break was over. I stood on unsteady legs, acutely aware of my coworkers' curious stares. I have to get back to work. Of course. He pulled out his wallet and left a $50 bill on the table for a $3 cup of coffee. Thank you for the conversation. As he stood to leave, my coworker Sarah materialized beside me, her eyes wide with curiosity and something that looked like concern. Who was that? She whispered. Just a customer. Loretta. She grabbed my arm, her voice urgent. Men like that don't walk into places like this without a reason. Be careful. I watched through the window as Lucchesi climbed into a sleek black sedan that had been idling at the curb. He didn't look back, but somehow I knew he was aware of my watching. That evening, I left work to find the same car waiting outside. The driver rolled down his window as I approached. Miss Capps, Mr. Cattaneo asked me to ensure you get home safely. I should have refused. Should have insisted I could take the bus like always. Instead, I found myself sliding into the leather interior, surrounded by the scent of expensive cologne and danger. As we pulled away from the curb, my phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number as last night. How do you always know where I am? I typed back before I could stop myself. The response came immediately. I pay attention. I stared at those 3 words as the city lights blurred past the window and realized with a mixture of terror and anticipation that my ordinary life was already over. Days blurred together in a strange new rhythm. Lucchesi appeared at the cafe with increasing frequency, sometimes in the morning before the rush, sometimes during my afternoon break, always ordering the same black coffee with 2 sugars. He never stayed long, but his presence lingered like smoke after he left. He learned things about me, small things, that I preferred chocolate croissants over plain ones, that I rubbed my left temple when I was tired, that I unconsciously hummed while I worked when I thought no one was listening. You have a beautiful voice, he said one Tuesday afternoon, appearing at the counter as I finished restocking the pastry case. I wasn't singing. You were humming, something classical. His eyes held that familiar intensity. Where did you learn it? My mother used to play piano. The words slipped out before I could stop them. I rarely talked about my parents, but something about his quiet attention made the memories surface. She taught me a few pieces before the accident. I nodded, surprised he remembered. Most people forgot details like that, filed them away as unimportant background noise. But Lucchesi collected my words like precious stones. Play for me sometime, he said. I don't have a piano. I do. The simple statement hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of his cologne and a $20 tip for a $3 coffee. But his growing presence in my life didn't go unnoticed. Look at her, I heard Sarah whisper to Marcus, our line cook during the lunch rush. Think she's some kind of mafia princess now. I pretended not to hear, focusing on taking orders and refilling coffee cups. But the words stung more than they should have. It's pathetic, really, Sarah continued, her voice carrying just loud enough for me to catch every word. He's obviously slumming it. Rich guys like that, they get bored and move on to the next charity case. Marcus grunted his agreement. Seen it before. Girl thinks she's special, then reality hits. I gripped the coffee pot tighter, my knuckles white against the black handle. These were people I'd worked alongside for 2 years, people I'd covered shifts for when they were sick, people I'd considered friends. The whispers followed me home. Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door, who used to smile and ask about my day, now watched me through her peephole when I climbed the stairs. The bus driver, who usually nodded in greeting, looked right through me when I boarded. Word traveled fast in my neighborhood. The girl from 3B was mixed up with dangerous people. The girl from 3B thought she was better than everyone else now. It came to a head on Thursday evening when Lucchesi walked me to the bus stop after my shift. He did this sometimes now, appearing at closing time with that quiet authority that made arguing seem pointless. "You don't have to do this," I said as we walked. "I've been getting home fine for years." "Humor me." We'd reached the corner when I spotted them. 3 women from my building clustered near the convenience store, their voices carrying in the evening air. "There she is," one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Little Miss Special with her sugar daddy." "Probably doesn't even know what he really does for a living," another added with a harsh laugh. "Girls like her, they see the money and stop asking questions." My cheeks burned with humiliation. Beside me, Lucchesi went very still, his attention shifting to the women with predatory focus. "Friends of yours?" he asked quietly. "Neighbors." I tugged at his sleeve, desperate to escape. "Can we just go?" But he was already moving, crossing the street with that fluid grace that somehow managed to be both elegant and threatening. I hurried after him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying that silk over steel quality I'd come to recognize. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." The women fell silent, suddenly aware they were face to face with the subject of their gossip. Up close, Lucchesi's presence was overwhelming. Expensive suit, perfect posture, and those dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "We weren't," one of them started. "You were discussing Loretta." He stepped closer, and I watched them instinctively back away. "I'm curious about your concerns." "No concerns," the ringleader said quickly. "Just neighborhood talk." "Ah." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "And what exactly does the neighborhood think about Loretta?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the sidewalk and never resurface. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. His world colliding with mine, leaving destruction in its wake. "That's what I thought," Lucchesi said finally. His voice never rose, never carried a hint of threat, but something in his tone made the women scatter like startled birds. We walked the rest of the way to the bus stop in silence. When the bus arrived, I climbed the steps without looking back, but I could feel him watching until we disappeared around the corner. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and tried to recognize the girl looking back at me. Same face, same tired eyes. But something fundamental had shifted. I was caught between 2 worlds now. Too ordinary for his, too changed for mine. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, though I knew who it was before I looked. "Are you all right?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Why do you care?" "Because you matter." 3 simple words that hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had said that to me? When was the last time I'd felt like I mattered to anyone? "This is complicated," I typed. "The best things usually are." I set the phone aside without responding, but his words echoed in my head as I tried to sleep. Outside my window, I thought I heard a car engine idling in the darkness, but when I looked, the street was empty. The next morning brought a new reality. Janet pulled me aside before my shift started, her expression carefully neutral. "Loretta, honey, we need to talk." My stomach dropped. "About what?" "About your friend. The one who's been coming in." She twisted her hands nervously. Some of the other employees are concerned, and a few customers have mentioned feeling uncomfortable. He's never done anything wrong. I know, but his presence is disruptive. People are talking. I understood what she wasn't saying. In a neighborhood like this, reputation was everything, and mine was becoming a liability. What are you asking me to do? Janet's face crumpled with sympathy and fear. Maybe you could ask him to give you some space, just until things calm down. I nodded numbly, knowing I had no choice. This job was all I had, the only thing keeping me afloat in a world that suddenly felt hostile and uncertain. But as I tied my apron strings and started the morning routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that asking Lucchesi for space would be like asking the ocean to stop being wet. Some forces of nature couldn't be reasoned with. They could only be survived. I managed to avoid Lucchesi for 3 days. When he appeared at the cafe, I sent Sarah to take his order. When he lingered by the counter, I found urgent tasks in the back room. When he texted, I didn't respond. It was cowardly, but I told myself it was necessary. Janet's warning had been clear enough, and I couldn't afford to lose this job. Not when it was the only thing standing between me and complete financial ruin. But avoiding him felt like holding my breath underwater, possible for a while, but ultimately unsustainable. On Friday night, I stayed late to help with inventory, hoping the extra hours would distract me from the growing ache in my chest. By the time I finished, the cafe was dark and empty, the streets outside gleaming with rain from an earlier storm. I pulled my thin jacket tighter and headed for the bus stop, my footsteps echoing off wet pavement. The neighborhood felt different at night, shadows deeper, sounds sharper, the familiar becoming foreign and potentially dangerous. I was halfway to the corner when I heard footsteps behind me, too heavy and deliberate to be casual. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep walking at a steady pace. Probably just another late worker heading home. But when I turned onto the side street that led to the bus stop, a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me into the narrow alley between 2 buildings. "Easy there, sweetheart." The voice was rough, whiskey-soaked, familiar in a way that made my blood run cold. "Just want to have a little chat." Aldo Manfredi. I recognized him from the council meeting, one of the older men who'd watched me with calculating eyes. Up close, he reeked of alcohol and expensive cologne gone sour. "Let me go." I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, fingers digging into my arm hard enough to bruise. "Not yet. See, I've been watching you, little cafe girl. Watching you play house with Lucchesi like you're something special." His breath was hot against my face, making my stomach turn. "But you're not special, are you? You're just another stupid girl who thinks she can handle a man like him." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" He laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Let me tell you about the last girl who thought she was different. Pretty little thing, just like you. Thought she could change him. Thought she could be the one to tame the beast." My heart hammered against my ribs. What happened to her? She asked too many questions. Started poking around in business that wasn't hers. His grip shifted, thumb pressing against the pulse point in my wrist. One day she was there, next day she wasn't. Funny how that works. "You're lying." "Am I?" He leaned closer, and I could see the broken blood vessels in his eyes, the cruel twist of his mouth. "Ask him about Elena sometime. Ask him what happens when girls like you get too comfortable, start thinking they belong in our world." Elena. The name hit me like a physical blow, confirming what I'd been trying not to think about. There had been someone before me. Someone who'd stood where I was standing, felt what I was feeling. Someone who'd disappeared. Lucchesi doesn't love Sweetheart. He uses. He consumes. And when he's done... Aldo shrugged, the gesture casual and terrifying. Well, let's just say our world has ways of cleaning up messes. I yanked my arm free with sudden desperate strength, stumbling backward until my shoulders hit the brick wall. Stay away from me. I'm trying to help you. But his smile was predatory, enjoying my fear. Though I have to admit, watching you fall is going to be entertaining. They always think they're different. They never learn. I shoved past him and ran, my cheap shoes slipping on wet pavement as I fled toward the main street. Behind me, I heard his laughter echoing off the alley walls, following me like a curse. I didn't stop running until I reached the bus stop, chest heaving, hands shaking so badly I could barely dig my phone from my pocket. 3 missed calls from Lucchesi, 2 text messages asking if I was okay. The bus arrived in a haze of diesel fumes and fluorescent light. I climbed aboard on unsteady legs, finding a seat near the back where I could watch the street through rain-streaked windows. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Lucchesi. "Where are you?" "I'm at the cafe." I stared at the message, Aldo's words echoing in my head. "Ask him about Elena sometime." My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I should tell him what happened. Should let him know that one of his associates had cornered me in an alley, threatened me, tried to scare me away. But what if Aldo was right? What if this was all some elaborate game, and I was just the latest player who didn't know the rules? "I'm fine," I typed back. "Got home safe." "Are you sure? You sound different." Different. Because I was different now. Because I'd looked into the abyss of his world and seen something that made my blood run cold. Just tired. Long day. The lies came easier than they should have. But how could I tell him about Aldo's warning when I didn't know if he was the predator or the protector in this scenario? At home, I double-locked my door and checked the windows twice before finally collapsing on my couch. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Aldo's cruel smile, heard his whiskey-rough voice talking about girls who disappeared. Elena. Who was she? What had she meant to Lucchesi? And why had Aldo chosen tonight, when I was alone and vulnerable, to tell me about her? My phone buzzed one more time. A final text from Lucchesi. "Sweet dreams, Loretta." I stared at those words until they blurred together, wondering if they were a promise or a threat. In his world, maybe there wasn't a difference. Outside my window, a car engine started up and drove slowly away, but when I looked, the street was empty except for shadows and rain. I pulled my blanket up to my chin and tried not to think about Elena, about what questions she'd asked that had made her inconvenient. Tried not to wonder if I was already asking the same ones. But Aldo's final words followed me into restless sleep. "Ask him what happened to the last girl if you're brave enough." The question was I brave enough to hear the answer? I woke to the sound of sirens wailing past my window, their urgent cry cutting through the gray morning like a knife. My first thought was of Aldo's whiskey-soaked breath against my face, his cruel laughter echoing in the alley. My second thought was much worse. The news came during my morning break, whispered between customers like a prayer or a curse. "Did you hear about Aldo Manfredi?" Sarah's voice was hushed, excited in the way people get when tragedy strikes someone they don't like. "Found him in an alley behind Torino's restaurant, beaten half to death." My coffee cup slipped from numb fingers, shattering against the break room floor. "What?" "Robbery gone wrong, they're saying. But everyone knows. She lowered her voice even further. Everyone knows you don't just randomly target guys like that. Someone wanted to send a message. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Less than 12 hours after Aldo had cornered me in that alley, he was lying in a hospital bed, broken and barely breathing. Coincidence? In Lucchesi's world, I was beginning to understand there was no such thing. My hands shook as I cleaned up the broken ceramic, each shard reflecting my fractured thoughts. Had I caused this? Had my silence somehow triggered this violence? Or was this simply what happened to people who crossed lines they didn't know existed? I made it through my shift on autopilot, serving coffee and pastries while my mind raced in circles. When closing time finally came, I couldn't face going home to my empty apartment where every shadow might hide answers I wasn't ready to hear. Instead, I found myself walking to the other side of town, to a small house with a garden full of roses and memories. Mrs. Vaughn had been my mother's closest friend, the woman who'd held me at the funeral when I was too young to understand that my parents weren't coming back. She answered the door in her faded housecoat, silver hair pinned back with bobby pins that had seen better decades. But her eyes were sharp as ever, taking in my pale face and shaking hands with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen too much of life's darker corners. "Loretta, sweetheart, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "Mrs. Vaughn, I need to ask you something about the past." She studied my face for a long moment, then stepped aside to let me in. The house smelled like lavender and old books, exactly as I remembered from childhood visits when the world had been simpler and safer. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the worn velvet sofa. "I'll make tea." But I couldn't sit still. I paced her small living room, past photographs of my parents and memories of better times, until she returned with a tray that rattled slightly in her hands. "Now then," she said, settling into her favorite chair. "What's got you so worked up?" "It's about a man, Lucchesi Cattaneo." The teacup froze halfway to her lips. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of her grandmother clock, marking seconds that felt like hours. "Where did you hear that name?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I met him. We've been..." I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insane. "Mrs. Vaughn, what do you know about the Cattaneo family?" She set down her cup with trembling fingers, tea sloshing over the rim. "Oh, Loretta, oh, my dear girl, what have you gotten yourself into? Tell me, please." For a long moment, she just stared at her hands, liver spotted and worn from decades of hard work. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain. "I knew his father, Antonio Cattaneo." The name fell from her lips like a stone into still water. "This was, 30 years ago now. I was young, foolish, working as a seamstress in the garment district." My heart hammered against my ribs. "You knew him?" "Knew him?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I loved him, or thought I did. He was so charming, so magnetic. When Antonio Cattaneo walked into a room, everyone else faded to gray." The description sent chills down my spine. It could have been Lucchesi she was describing. "What happened?" "At first, it was like a fairy tale. Expensive dinners, beautiful clothes, a world I'd never imagined I could touch." Her eyes grew distant, lost in memories that clearly still had the power to wound. "But fairy tales don't last, do they? Not in the real world." "Mrs. Vaughn." He was possessive, controlling. What started as protection became a cage. She looked at me directly then, her gaze sharp and urgent. "I wasn't his girlfriend, Loretta. I was his possession. Something beautiful to display when it suited him, something to lock away when it didn't. My mouth went dry. How did you get away? I became inconvenient. The words were bitter, final. I started asking questions about his business, about the men who came to the house at all hours. I wanted to understand the world I was living in. And one day, I simply wasn't useful anymore. He found someone younger, someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. She reached across the space between us, grasping my hands with surprising strength. I was lucky, Loretta. Lucky that he got bored instead of angry. Lucky that I was just an inconvenience instead of a threat. The room felt too small, too warm. I thought of Elena, the girl Aldo had mentioned. Had she been inconvenient too? Or had she crossed some other line, asked the wrong questions? The son, I whispered. Lucchesi, is he... I don't know. Mrs. Vaughn's voice was heavy with regret. I never met the boy, but he was raised by Antonio, shaped by that world, and men like that. She squeezed my hands tighter. They don't learn love, sweetheart. They learn possession. They learn control. But he's different. He listens to me. That's what I thought too. Her interruption was gentle but firm. Antonio listened to me at first, made me feel special, seen, important. But that attention comes with a price, and the bill always comes due. I pulled my hands free, standing on unsteady legs. I should go. Loretta. Her voice stopped me at the door. Whatever you're feeling for this man, whatever you think you see in him, remember that he learned how to love from his father. And his father never loved anything he didn't own. The walk home passed in a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. Mrs. Vaughn's words echoed in my head, mixing with Aldo's threats and the memory of Lucchesi's dark eyes watching me across crowded rooms. At my apartment, I found a single white rose on my doorstep, no note attached. But I knew who'd left it, just as I knew he was probably watching from somewhere in the shadows. I picked up the flower with shaking hands, its thorns drawing tiny drops of blood from my fingers. Beautiful and dangerous, like everything else in his world. Inside, I set the rose in a water glass and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. Mrs. Vaughn's warning rang in my ears. Never forget who taught him how to love. But as I touched the petals of his gift, I couldn't help wondering if some lessons could be unlearned, if some patterns could be broken, if love could triumph over the ghosts of the father. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Vaughn's haunted expression, heard Aldo's cruel laughter, felt the weight of secrets pressing down like a physical thing. By morning, I'd made my decision. I had to confront Lucchesi, had to ask the questions that might destroy whatever this was between us, but that I could no longer avoid. He appeared at the cafe during the lunch rush, as if summoned by my resolve. But instead of his usual table by the window, he approached the counter directly, his dark eyes searching my face with that unsettling intensity. "You look tired," he said quietly. "I need to talk to you." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, drawing curious glances from nearby customers. "Not here. Somewhere private." Something flickered across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "Of course. When do you finish?" 6. "I'll be waiting." He left without ordering coffee, without his usual lingering presence that had become as much a part of my routine as breathing. The absence felt like a wound. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every customer seemed to move in slow motion. Every task stretched into eternity. Sarah kept shooting me worried looks, but I couldn't explain the knot of dread and determination growing in my chest. At exactly 6 o'clock, I found him leaning against a sleek black car parked across from the cafe. He'd loosened his tie, rolled up his sleeves, but somehow managed to look even more dangerous in his casual dishevelment. "Where would you like to go?" he asked as I approached. "Somewhere we can talk without being overheard." He opened the passenger door without comment, and I slid into leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The car smelled like him, expensive cologne and something darker, more primal. We drove in silence through the city, past my neighborhood with its cracked sidewalks and broken dreams, into the hills where money bought privacy and secrets stayed buried. He pulled into a small park overlooking the city, the lights below twinkling like fallen stars. "What's troubling you, Loretta?" His voice was gentle, but I caught the steel underneath. I turned to face him, drawing strength from the distance between us. "Tell me about Aldo Manfredi." His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between us. "What about him?" "He cornered me last night, in an alley behind the cafe." I watched his hands tighten on the steering wheel, knuckles going white. "He told me about Elena." Now his mask slipped, just for a moment. I saw something raw and dangerous flash across his features before he regained control. "What exactly did he tell you?" "That there was a girl before me, that she asked too many questions and disappeared." My voice was steadier than I felt. "This morning, I heard Aldo was found beaten half to death. Funny timing, don't you think?" Lucchesi was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Aldo has many enemies. His accident could have been caused by any number of business disagreements. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you need." The dismissal stung, but I pressed on. "And Elena, what happened to her?" "Elena is none of your concern. She is if I'm following in her footsteps." I turned in my seat to face him fully. "I visited Mrs. Vaughn today. She told me about your father." This time, the reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His entire body went rigid, and when he looked at me, his eyes held a coldness that made my blood freeze. "You've been asking questions. Yes. In my world, that can be dangerous. Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." He reached across the space between us, his fingers trailing along my cheek with deceptive gentleness. "There are things about my life, my business, that you don't need to touch, for your own safety." I jerked away from his touch. Don't treat me like I'm too fragile to handle the truth." "The truth?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is that my world eats girls like you alive. The truth is that I should have walked away the moment I saw you in that hallway. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." His admission was quiet, almost vulnerable. And now we're both paying the price. I stared at him, this man who commanded rooms with his presence, who made grown men step aside with a glance. In the dim light of the car, he looked almost human, almost reachable. "I'm scared," I whispered. "You should be." "Of you." He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I'm not my father, Loretta, but I was raised by him, shaped by his world, his rules, his methods." He turned to look at me, and I saw something that might have been regret in his dark eyes. I don't know how to love without possessing. I don't know how to protect without controlling. The honesty in his voice broke something inside me. Then let me go. Is that what you want? I thought of Mrs. Vaughn's warnings, of Aldo's cruel laughter, of Elena, whose fate remained a mystery. I thought of my ordinary life, my safe routine, my small dreams that had never included marble halls and dangerous men. I don't know, I admitted. I'm tired of being treated like garbage by everyone just because I chose you. I'm tired of being kept half in, half out of your world. I'm tired of not knowing if you're protecting me or just collecting me. He reached for me again, and this time I didn't pull away. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, and I felt that familiar electricity that made rational thought impossible. If you walk away, he said quietly, I won't stop you. But don't lie to yourself and pretend you're not drawn to me. Don't pretend this thing between us isn't real. And if I stay, then you stay knowing exactly what I am, what my world is. No more illusions, no more protection from the truth. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. When I opened them, he was watching me with an intensity that stole my breath. I need time, I whispered. He nodded once, then started the car. The drive back to my apartment passed in heavy silence, both of us lost in thoughts too dangerous to voice. At my building, he walked me to the door like a gentleman, but as I climbed the stairs, I felt his eyes on me like a brand. From my window, I watched his car disappear into the night. But even after the taillights faded, I had the distinct feeling I was still being watched. In his world, I was learning, even space came with a price. 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Lucchesi didn't come to the cafe, he didn't text, he didn't send cars to follow me home. The silence should have been a relief, but instead it felt like holding my breath underwater, waiting for something inevitable to surface. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts and staying late to avoid the emptiness of my apartment. But even surrounded by the familiar chaos of the cafe, I felt his absence like a phantom limb. Something that should have been there but wasn't. You're miserable, Sarah observed during a rare quiet moment, watching me scrub the same table for the 3rd time. Just call him. I don't know what you're talking about. Right. And I don't know why you keep checking your phone every 5 minutes. She leaned against the counter, studying my face with unwelcome perception. Look, I know I said he was trouble, and he probably is. But you're not exactly thriving without him. I wanted to argue, but the words stuck in my throat, because she was right. I was withering without him, like a plant moved away from sunlight. That evening, as I was locking up the cafe, a familiar figure approached from the shadows. Not Lucchesi. I would have recognized his silhouette anywhere. This was someone smaller, older, wearing the kind of expensive coat that whispered rather than shouted wealth. Miss Capps? The voice was cultured, careful. My name is Vincent. I work for Mr. Cattaneo. My heart hammered against my ribs. Is he all right? He's fine, but he asked me to deliver this. Vincent held out a small package wrapped in black paper. He said you would understand. Inside was a man's watch. Expensive, elegant, with an inscription on the back that made my breath catch. Time stops for no one. L. Below it, a note in his precise handwriting. You left this at my apartment. There's a winter assembly at Red Marrow Estate tonight. The choice is yours. I stared at the watch, my mind racing. I'd never been to his apartment. This was clearly a pretext, an excuse to see him again without either of us having to admit we'd broken first. Will you be attending, miss? Vincent asked politely. I should have said no. Should have handed back the watch and walked away from whatever game this was. Instead, I heard myself saying, "What time?" 9:00. I can arrange transportation if you'd like. No, I'll find my own way. Vincent nodded and melted back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the weight of decision and a watch that felt like a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance. At home, I stared at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The same face looked back at me, but something fundamental had changed over the past weeks. I looked older, more fragile, like someone who'd seen too much and understood too little. I dressed carefully in the only decent dress I owned, a simple black number I'd bought for job interviews that had never materialized. It wasn't much, but it was mine, not borrowed or gifted or chosen by someone else. The bus ride to Red Marrow Estate felt like traveling to another planet. With each mile, the neighborhoods grew more expensive, the houses larger, the shadows deeper. By the time I reached the estate's imposing gates, my hands were shaking. Security recognized me this time, waving me through with bored efficiency, but their casual dismissal stung more than outright hostility would have. I was just another delivery girl to them, someone who occasionally appeared and would eventually disappear. Inside, the estate hummed with quiet activity. Men in expensive suits moved through marble corridors like sharks through dark water, their conversations dying when I passed. I caught fragments, shipments, territories, problems that needed to be resolved. I made my way toward the council chambers, clutching the watch like a talisman. Through open doorways, I glimpsed rooms full of men who looked like they could buy and sell entire city blocks before breakfast. Well, look what crawled back. I turned to find 3 men blocking my path, their faces familiar from that first night. Associates of Aldo's, judging by their sneering expressions and the way they positioned themselves to intimidate. "Gentlemen." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me." "Excuse you?" The tallest one laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think you can just waltz back in here like nothing happened? Like you didn't run crying to Daddy when things got too real?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." Another one stepped closer, his cologne cloying and aggressive. "Poor little cafe girl. Thought she was special. Thought she could handle playing in the big leagues." My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I forced myself to stand straighter. "I'm here to return something. That's all." "Return something?" The third man laughed. "Honey, the only thing you should be returning is yourself to whatever hole you crawled out of. Men like Lucchesi, they don't keep pets for long, especially not broken ones." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to wound. I thought of all the whispers at the cafe, all the sideways looks from neighbors, all the ways my life had become smaller and more complicated since I'd entered Lucchesi's orbit. "He's probably already forgotten your name," the tall one continued, enjoying my obvious distress. "Moved on to someone younger, prettier, less damaged." "That's enough." The voice cut through their laughter like a blade through silk. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. I could feel his presence like electricity in the air, could see the way the 3 men suddenly went pale and stepped back. But when I did turn, my breath caught in my throat. The entire hallway had gone silent. Men who'd been walking, talking, conducting business had all stopped what they were doing. And slowly, one by one, they were standing. Not just standing, rising to their feet with the kind of respect reserved for royalty or gods. I felt him before I saw him, that familiar weight of attention that made my skin prickle with awareness. Then he was there, moving through the crowd with fluid grace, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made everything else fade to gray. The men who'd been tormenting me scattered like leaves before a storm, suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. But Lucchesi's gaze never left my face, taking in my pale cheeks, my trembling hands, the tears I was fighting not to shed. Who spoke to her like that? His voice was quiet, conversational, but it carried the kind of authority that made grown men confess their sins. No one answered immediately. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken threats and the weight of absolute power. He called out specific names, his tone never rising but somehow becoming more terrifying with each syllable. Made it clear that disrespecting me was disrespecting him. And in that moment, I finally understood what I'd been too naive to see before. This wasn't just attraction. This wasn't just a rich man's passing fancy. I was under his protection, his claim, his ownership. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, as I watched powerful men cower before his quiet fury, I felt something else entirely. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. The silence in the hallway stretched like a held breath. I stood frozen in the center of it all, clutching Lucchesi's watch so tightly the metal edges bit into my palm. Around me, men who commanded empires with a word or a glance suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. I asked a question. Lucchesi's voice remained conversational, but something in his tone made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Who spoke to her like that? The 3 men who'd cornered me had melted into the crowd, but there was nowhere to hide in his presence. He moved through the assembled group with predatory grace, his attention shifting from face to face like a searchlight seeking targets. Marco. He stopped in front of the tall one who'd called me damaged. Step forward. Marco's face had gone ashen, but he had no choice but to comply. In Lucchesi's world, disobedience wasn't an option. Repeat what you said to Miss Capps. We were just... Marco's voice cracked like a teenager's. We didn't mean anything by it. You didn't mean anything? Lucchesi nodded thoughtfully. So when you called her broken, that was meaningless? When you suggested I'd forgotten her name, that was just idle conversation? The watching men shifted uncomfortably. I could feel their collective tension, the way they all seemed to be holding their breath. This wasn't just about me. This was about respect, hierarchy, the unspoken rules that govern their world. Answer me, Marco. We thought she was just... Marco's eyes darted desperately around the room, seeking support that wasn't coming. We thought she was temporary. Temporary? Lucchesi repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. And what gave you that impression? She ran away, disappeared for weeks. We thought. Marco's voice trailed off as he realized he was digging his own grave with every word. You thought what? That because she needed time to think she was fair game for your amusement? Lucchesi stepped closer, and Marco actually flinched. That because she wasn't here, she didn't matter? I wanted to disappear, to sink through the marble floor and never resurface. This public humiliation, both mine and Marco's, felt like a violation, a display of power that left everyone involved diminished. But then Lucchesi turned to look at me, and something in his expression made my breath catch. Not possession or control, but something raw. Something that looked almost like vulnerability. Miss Capps, he said formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the hallway. Would you join me in the council chamber? It wasn't really a request, but the way he offered his arm, the careful courtesy in his gesture, made it feel like a choice. I walked toward him on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of every eye tracking my movement. The council chamber was exactly as I remembered. Long mahogany table, leather chairs, oil paintings of stern-faced men who'd probably ruled this world before Lucchesi was born. But now the room felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. The council members were already seated, their faces carefully neutral. But I caught the quick glances they exchanged, the way they straightened almost imperceptibly when Lucchesi entered. "Gentlemen," he said, taking his place at the head of the table, "I believe you all remember Miss Capps." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled around the table. Some nodded politely, others studied me with calculating eyes. I recognized a few faces from that first night. Older men with silver hair and expensive suits who looked like they'd been born to power. "There seems to be some confusion," Lucchesi continued, his tone conversational but carrying an undercurrent of steel, "about Miss Capps's status, about her importance. I thought it best to clarify." My heart hammered against my ribs. What was he doing? What was he about to announce to these powerful men who could destroy me with a word? "Some of you may have gotten the impression that Miss Capps is temporary, a passing interest." His dark eyes swept the table, cataloging reactions. "I want to correct that misunderstanding." The silence was deafening. I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears, could feel the weight of a dozen gazes assessing, judging, calculating. "Miss Capps is under my protection," Lucchesi said quietly. "She is not to be threatened, intimidated, or disrespected in any way. Anyone who fails to understand this will answer to me personally." One of the older council members, a man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, leaned forward slightly. "Lucchesi, with respect, the girl has been absent for weeks. You assumed wrong." The interruption was soft but final. "Miss Capps's presence or absence doesn't change her status. It doesn't make her fair game for your entertainment or your cruelty." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. I wouldn't cry here, not in front of these men who already saw me as weak. "Furthermore," Lucchesi continued, "I want it understood that any disrespect shown to Miss Capps is disrespect shown to me. Any threat against her is a threat against me. Any harm that comes to her will be answered in kind." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Around the table, I watched as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about protection. This was about power, territory, the complex web of alliances and enmities that govern their world. "Are we clear?" Lucchesi asked. A chorus of murmured agreement filled the room. But I could see the calculation in their eyes, the way they were already adjusting their mental maps to account for this new reality. I was no longer just the cafe girl who'd stumbled into their world. I was Lucchesi Cattaneo's. What? Girlfriend seemed too simple. Property felt too harsh. But whatever I was now officially under the protection of the most dangerous man in the room. The meeting continued, but I barely heard the discussions of territories and shipments and problems that needed to be resolved. All I could think about was the weight of what had just happened, the way my life had been fundamentally altered by a few carefully chosen words. When the meeting finally ended, the council members filed out with polite nods in my direction. But I caught the looks they exchanged, the whispered conversations that started the moment they thought they were out of earshot. Lucchesi and I were alone in the chamber, the silence heavy with unspoken words. "You didn't have to do that," I said finally. "Yes, I did." He moved to stand beside my chair, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. They needed to understand. Understand what? He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with that unsettling intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That you're not going anywhere. That this, whatever this is between us, isn't temporary. I looked up at him, this man who commanded rooms with his presence, who made grown men step aside with a glance. And what if I want to leave? Then you leave. His answer was immediate, certain. But you leave knowing that you'll always have a place here, that you'll always be under my protection. Even if I don't want it, especially then. The honesty in his voice broke something inside me, because I realized, sitting in that room surrounded by the ghosts of power and violence, that I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay, wanted to be the woman the council stood for, wanted to be his. Lucchesi led me from the council chamber through a maze of marble corridors I'd never seen before, past rooms where shadows moved behind frosted glass, and conversations died when we passed. We climbed a curved staircase to a balcony that overlooked the estate's gardens, the city lights twinkling beyond like fallen stars. The night air was crisp against my skin, carrying the scent of winter roses and something darker, the weight of secrets and power that clung to this place like expensive perfume. You're angry, he said, not looking at me as he gripped the stone railing. I'm confused. I moved to stand beside him, careful to maintain distance between us. What just happened in there? You made me sound like your property. Is that what you heard? Wasn't it? I turned to face him, studying his profile in the moonlight. All that talk about protection and status and threats. You basically announced to your entire council that I belong to you. Do you? His dark eyes met mine, and I saw something vulnerable there, something that looked almost like fear. Belong to me? The question hung between us like a challenge. I thought of the past weeks, the emptiness without him, the way I'd withered like a plant moved away from sunlight. I thought of Mrs. Vaughn's warnings and Aldo's cruel laughter and Elena, whose fate remained a mystery. I don't know, I whispered. I don't know what belonging to you means. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands tightening on the railing until his knuckles went white. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been regret. It means I had Aldo beaten because he threatened you. It means I've had men watching your apartment every night since you asked for space, making sure you were safe. It means I can't sleep without knowing where you are. My breath caught. You've been watching me? Protecting you? The distinction seemed important to him. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like control. Maybe it is. His admission was quiet, honest in a way that cut deeper than any lie. I told you I don't know how to love without possessing. I don't know how to care without controlling. I stared at him, this man who commanded empires with a word, who made grown men cower with a glance. In the moonlight, he looked almost human, almost reachable. Then learn, I said. What? Learn how to love without possessing. Learn how to care without controlling. I stepped closer, close enough to see the surprise flicker across his features. Because I'm tired of being treated like garbage by everyone just because I chose you. I'm tired of being kept half in, half out of your world, and I'm tired of pretending this thing between us isn't real. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with devastating gentleness. What are you saying, Loretta? I'm saying I choose you." The words came out stronger than I felt, but once they were spoken, I knew they were true. Not because I'm naive about what you are or what your world is. Not because I think I can change you or save you or any of that romantic nonsense. Then why? I thought of all the reasons I should walk away. The danger, the violence, the way his world consumed everything it touched. I thought of Mrs. Vaughn's warnings and my mother's dreams for me and the safe, ordinary life I was about to abandon. Because when you look at me, I'm not invisible, I said finally. Because for the first time in my life, someone sees me as worth protecting, worth claiming, worth standing up for. His thumb traced my lower lip, and I felt that familiar electricity that made rational thought impossible. "And Elena, aren't you afraid you'll end up like her?" The question I'd been dreading, the ghost that had haunted every interaction between us. I met his gaze steadily, seeing the pain there, the guilt he carried like a weight. "Tell me what happened to her." He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She was curious, like you. Started asking questions about my business, about the men who came to the house. I tried to keep her separate from that world, but she wanted to understand. And one night, she followed me to a meeting, saw things she shouldn't have seen, heard things that put her in danger." His hand dropped from my face, and he turned back to the railing. I had to choose between her safety and her presence in my life. My heart clenched. You sent her away. I gave her a new identity, a new life somewhere safe, somewhere my enemies couldn't find her. He looked at me then, and I saw the cost of that decision written in every line of his face. She hated me for it, called me a monster, said I was just like my father. But she's alive. She's alive. The words were heavy with loss. And she's safe, and she'll never forgive me for making that choice for her. I understood then why Aldo's threats had been so effective, why the specter of Elena had haunted our relationship. Not because Lucchesi had killed her, but because he'd loved her enough to let her go. "I'm not Elena," I said quietly. "No, you're not." He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes searching my face. "You're stronger than she was, more stubborn, more willing to fight for what you want. And what do I want? You tell me." I thought of the council chamber, the way those powerful men had straightened when he spoke my name. I thought of the protection he offered, the danger that came with it, the choice between safety and significance. "I want to stay," I said. "Not as your possession or your pet or your dirty little secret. I want to stay as the woman who stands beside you when councils rise, as someone who matters in your world." "It won't be easy," he warned. "My enemies will see you as a weakness to exploit. My allies will test your resolve. And He paused, vulnerability flickering across his features. "I'll probably try to control you more than I should. Then I'll fight you when you do." I stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "I'll remind you that love isn't ownership, that protection doesn't require possession. And if I can't learn, if I'm too much like my father..." I thought of Mrs. Vaughn's warnings, of the patterns that seemed destined to repeat, but I also thought of the way he'd looked at me in that council chamber, not like property, but like something precious, something worth defending. "Then we'll figure it out together," I said, "because some patterns can be broken, some lessons can be unlearned." He kissed me then, soft and desperate and full of promises neither of us was sure we could keep. When we broke apart, I could see the city spread out below us, A world of light and shadow, danger and possibility. "Are you sure?" he asked against my lips. I thought of my ordinary life, my safe routine, my small dreams that had never included marble halls and dangerous men. I thought of the girl I'd been just months ago, invisible and ignored and utterly forgettable. "I'm sure," I whispered, because I was no longer that girl. I was the woman the Mafia Council stood for because he did. I was chosen, claimed, protected. I was his. And for the first time in my life, that felt like enough.